What if the biggest obstacle to understanding how work changes is the word job? And what would it look like to manage work rather than jobs as the fundamental unit of analysis and organization? My guest today is John Boudreau, professor emeritus at USC and one of the most influential thinkers on the future of HR and workforce strategy. Here's our talk. Welcome to the Economics of Work. I'm so excited to welcome John Boudreau. John, I know I've told you this before, but I think of you as kind of the preeminent philosopher of work. So I hope that's a title you're cool with.
Yeah, those kinds of things start to crop up more often as I get older. I've noticed.
Yeah, I feel like this philosopher of X is like...
I get philosopher and sage and
Yeah, you have to graduate into that.
That's exactly right. I'm not at the stage you are where I was this, brilliant new kid with a new book and, first book and all that. So yeah, it's been a while.
Well, when you were a brilliant new kid, then I assume you had a different angle, a different persona, right?
A little bit. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. How would you characterize your style, your reputation when you first started compared to now?
Well, I first started as an academic, as an absolutely straight up, research PhD from Purdue University. And I tell everybody, I grew up in New Mexico and went to college in southern New Mexico. And I thought I was super fortunate when Purdue admitted me. And so I got an MBA and then a PhD there. And I thought, okay, that's great. I'll go back to New Mexico. And this Purdue thing on my resume will probably get me a decent teaching job at some regional university in New Mexico. And lo and behold, other universities called up, including Cornell. So off I went to Cornell in 1981, and certainly the next 10 years were pretty much straight up publisher parish academic. And in those days, I got very lucky because having had an MBA, I was a little differently qualified than a lot of industrial psychologists. My degree was kind of business plus economics plus psychology. And it turned out that the field of IO psychology became quite fixated and fascinated with the dollar valued payoff from things like better selection, better training, et cetera. And they called it utility analysis. And it involved a whole bunch of equations based on the normal curve and all that stuff that I remember I spent hours on a exponent with 15 terms in it one time to figure out what was going on. So that was, I kind of got research famous for developing models to calculate the value. And then I put in some of the economic stuff like discounted present value. And we had a whole simulation about if they stay or if they go and all that stuff. So yeah, those were heady times leading up to tenure in about 1986, 1987, and then started working with companies because Cornell is so prominent in the HR world. By 90, we had founded the Center for Advanced HR Studies, so executives were coming to meet with us and all that kind of thing. So then I started working more with companies, and in the late 90s, met Pete Ramstad. And Pete is a CFO and studied accounting and accounting history at the graduate level and math at the PhD level. And he started saying things like, I'm looking at bond ratings, John, and they're an imperfect signal of the payoff of a future asset, says Pete. And I said, yeah. And he said, I work for Personnel Decisions International, and we have, in those days, filing cabinets full of ratings of executives using our bespoke technique, of simulations and interviews and all that. And he said, I don't see why business leaders don't treat executive ratings like bond ratings. And instead, they rely on their gut. They have all kinds of weird, rules of thumb about succession and who to hire and all that stuff. And they'd never get away with that if they were buying a bond. You'd expect them to have a good idea about the risk level and what they're getting and all that stuff. So that was kind of the first of now, 25 years of conversations with Pete about the difference between financial, call them assets or financial decisions and people decisions. And that's what led to what which is the book Beyond HR with Harvard in 2007. And then, of course, got interested in the future of work with Robin J. Suthasan and did 5 books with him, the last few on things like automation and gig work and deconstructing. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so much there, so much to unpack. But on this idea of this comparison of labor markets and capital markets, we have very sophisticated capital markets, financial markets, and we do not have sophisticated labor markets. And you've been, fighting the good fight, trying to push the world to become more rigorous, more mathematical, scientific. How is that going? Do you think? Yeah, I guess there's 2 questions within this question. One is are we getting close to where you think we should be? And what has held us back, in your opinion?
Those are very good questions. I think I'd have to say we're not as far as I hoped when I started this in 1981. Coming in with an MBA, looking at HR, saying, wow, there's so many tools we could bring over. These business leaders are perfectly comfortable. For example, take another one, production models. These leaders are perfectly comfortable thinking about bottlenecks in a manufacturing system, supply chain, et cetera. And yet when I say, why don't you invest your people investments where they make the biggest difference? They look at me like I'm from another planet. And they say, well, no, John, we need the best person we can get in every single role. So even back then, and I would say, well, let me just take your mind to another place. Suppose we're talking about a product, or you could pick any system. If I wanted to improve that system, where would I improve it? Would I improve everything by 10%? Think about a flow system. Would I improve the capacity everywhere? And they immediately know, well, of course not. Well, where would I improve it? Well, you'd improve it at the bottleneck, right? I mean, it's just like they've been trained in it. They know how to think in it. And I'll just say, are there people that affect that bottleneck? Well, yeah, I guess so. And well, do you think it would make sense to invest more there, perhaps, than in the people parts that are not affecting a bottleneck at the moment, which leads to all kinds of opening up of what's the payoff to performance? Where does performance improvement make the biggest difference? And so that was, gosh, now it's probably 30, 35 years ago. And, we did a big project on the future of HR back in 2013, 2015. And Jody Starkman is now writing up a report about what happened, right? And I think as all of us look back, all the retired CHROs I talked to, et cetera, everyone very, very impressed with what HR is and what it does and the progress it's made. I think they're all very happy with the work they did. And there's kind of an undercurrent drumbeat of thought we'd be further along than this in terms of rigor, in terms of decision models, in terms of some kind of a professional point of view about how decisions about people should be made, in the same way that finance brings a very consistent point of view to the table when you say, how should I make decisions about financial resources?
A lot of interesting ideas there too. I mean, on the bottlenecks point, I feel like now is kind of the moment where, everyone's talking about AI bottlenecks.
Yeah.
And that allows us to, think about bottlenecks in the work production process. And, there's some recognition that, the economic limitations on what AI can do is based on where the bottlenecks are in the workflows. Yeah. But I think what that brings us is this question of how do you identify bottlenecks? Is there a proactive way to identify that? What workers are the most pivotal in a production process?
Yeah.
Is that just you kind of have to know the business and take it case by case, or do you think there's a more systematic way to do that?
Well, I think there is, and it also is case by case. So I think what we have are existing systems that have been applied elsewhere than the talent realm. And I think you're right. I think every organization has identified AI as a bottleneck at a very high strategic level and are investing as if the people involved in AI were actually, sort of different by the nature of their
Wait, what do you mean
value.
when you say AI is the bottleneck? Do you mean the parts that kind of complement AI as the bottleneck? What do you mean by that?
Well, that's another good question. I don't know what's in the minds of leaders. I guess what I'm getting at is merely this. AI is sucking the energy. Every discussion about strategy, every discussion about future markets, every discussion about processes, every discussion about talent is, AI is this massive, I could call it a black hole, but it's this attractor. And that's what I mean, is this is a time when people are looking at AI, whatever they think that means, however they think it might be applied, they're getting a lot of pressure to have a point of view and a strategy and to have a plan to create value. Beyond that, I think it is kind of case by case. And I think organizations vary a lot, leadership teams vary a lot in how sophisticated they are about thinking about, well, what do we mean by AI? And do we want to pay attention to the bottlenecks, or is it just let a million flowers bloom? So probably the traditional approach to talent is let's just give everybody some chosen LLM, and everybody in our company ought to be really good at AI. And we want them to experiment, et cetera. And I would say, with all due respect, I suspect if we drop back, and the tools I would use to find the bottlenecks would be the ones that their production or their planners, maybe their strategists, already use. So we know how to find bottlenecks in a call center, in a production process, in a supply chain, et cetera. That is not rocket science, and it's not a new thing. Just go talk to your operations research folks. And then the trick is, when you find those pivot points in your processes, to step back and say, what are the human elements that contribute here to that part? And only then, really, would I say we start to get into the work and work redesign and what's underneath the work, things like skills and capabilities. But, Pete and I wrote about this in the Beyond HR book. Our idea is you really have to start with best of all world strategy, even though those get much more short term, drop down to resources and processes, find the pivot points in those things, pretty standard strategy. And then with those in hand, you can then begin to look at your workforce and say, where would our investments pay off?
I never really thought about this, field having a point of view point before, but I do think it resonates. When I think of finance and economics and operations research, there's some sense of consensus among key issues or among like the way to think about a certain problem. And when I think of IO Psych, I think in some way the greatest strength of IO Psych is that they are embedded into businesses in ways that economists are really not. And they go and solve particular problems. But do you think the dark side of being embedded into a business is that you get sort of wrapped up in those idiosyncratic needs too much and fail to kind of step back and create like a mathematical framework?
Yeah, I think there is a danger in that. I would agree with you that certainly in practice, the Society of Industrial Psychologists includes a lot of people that are deeply embedded in organizations. And they show up in, as you well know, right, in people analytics functions, very often in particular functions where the organization felt psychology would be a benefit, like maybe performance management or recruiting, selection, et cetera. So I think you're right. That said, IO psychologists, and we talked earlier about Alexis Fink, my good colleague, and she'd be the expert I'd consult on this. But I think it really varies because this profession of HR is so variable across organizations, right? It's not really like finance. And this is something Pete and I are working on now. Finance has some pretty structured relationships with the audit committee, with the strategy process, et cetera. Often many of them legally mandated. Controllers in the business have a connection to their finance profession first that gives them that point of view that they use then to help businesses, et cetera. I think very often psychology and HR more generally is not defined very well. There isn't generally accepted accounting principles for people. There isn't an investor oversight group making sure that you approach your people decisions in a rigorous way. There isn't a job description of the CHRO that's codified in regulations or anything like that. And so what can happen is you often have very talented IO psychologists kind of stuck way, way down deep in a people analytics function. Worst case producing dashboards and really terrific analyses that never really see the light of day. And then of course you have others that are very close to maybe the business partners, et cetera, and are working a little more closely on the business issues. But I think it really varies. And I think the tradition has been that these psychologists go to a function within HR or go to a people analytics group within HR. The danger there is that, and it's true about a lot of HR, about a lot of the work you and I do, I worry that there's so much great work out there that never, ever sees the light of day at a board meeting, at a strategy session, in the minds of leaders outside the fields of, say labor economics or IO psychology or HR. And one of the things I'd love to see more of is that there were platforms where that input was expected. In strategy processes, the board expected to hear about the frameworks that are being used, the points of view that are being used, and there'd be kind of an accountability to be rigorous about them in the way that you're accountable to be rigorous, just to take the easy one, about financial resources.
Yeah.
So I think that's the issue for IO psychology, is often that they're doing amazing work. And as you say, they often come to it with the imprimatur and the reality of sort of a scholarly profession that has thought a lot about good decision models. We know a lot about human behavior at work. We know a lot about performance management, about motivation, about engagement, about selection, attrition, et cetera. Decades and decades, 50 years, 100 years of research on that stuff. And yet I see business leaders, not in HR, doing all these seat of the pants decisions. Return to office is the easy poster child. How many CEOs have publicly said, well, I went to a meeting of CEOs. They're all bringing everybody back to the office. I'm going to insist that we bring everybody back to the office. I think it's seldom the right decision to bring everybody back to the office on a mandate. There are a much more nuanced way to approach it. And yet you don't really see those models so I think a bottleneck, Ben, is Pete and I call them the leadership platforms for the HR profession. And it'd be things like, when in the cycle of board discussions do they want to know what is our decision framework about people? What is our decision framework about how work and AI are going to combine? Is it a simplistic model of, we know it's like automation. We just put AI in, we get FTEs back, we do those layoffs, and we make money. And are the people in charge of doing AI know that their payoff needs to be FTEs handed back to the organization, or the ability to do layoffs or allow attrition to reduce our workforce? That's just one Pretty simple model. It'd be like saying, well, we're going to automate the factory floor, and the only measure I'm going to look at is, do we get FTEs out of it? And I think people would say, no, I think you'd be more sophisticated about your factory floor automation. You'd have a better protocol, a better framework, or as Pete and I call them, a decision model. I feel like the profession has so much to give, and very often the platform isn't there.
In just like fantasy land,
Yeah.
if you were running the Department of Labor or something, would you want to make a human capital accounting standards board the way that FASB exists, or some generally accepted human capital principles like GAAP or something like that? Like, do you think that would be a sort of sufficient solution to kind of get sort of the leaders, the investors, the boards thinking about this?
That's a good question. And I want to give due credit to colleagues. The main one that comes up in my mind is Wayne Cassio, who was a mentor and a colleague of mine for many, many years. And Wayne is an extraordinarily generous individual and has spent such an amount of time on committees that fashioned themselves as, we're going to come up with a set of HR measurements that should be required of all companies and presumably legislated into financial standards, legal standards, et cetera. And let's make a list of all the things that you ought to be tracking about your people and about your workforce. And I think, kind of not surprisingly, right, that becomes a bit of, sort of the dangers of trying to reach consensus, is that you end up with long lists of things. And I think what's missing is often the people proposing a measurement, let's say employee turnover, have a model in their mind. The IO psychologist or the economists or others have a model about what causes turnover, how it affects the organization, et cetera, right? Not all turnover is bad, for example. And the turnover rate is hardly enough to know what's going on. I think people who propose that understand it. But when the measure is used by decision makers outside of HR, it's not that they're not smart, but because they haven't been trained in how to think about something like people turnover, they go to simplistic models like turnover is bad and we ought to be filling all our positions internally and all that stuff, where they never go to those kinds of extreme points with other assets because they understand the nuances. So what we need, I think, Ben, is more codified points of view than codified measures. So finance has a theory of the firm, right? And yes, there are a million financial measures, but they're grounded in the thing we all learned in financial economics, right? A theory of the firm that includes things like internal rate of return, net present value, a lot of them that evolved in the 20th century to try and clean up really bad financial decisions, like let's invest in our biggest division more because it's big, or because it has more sales. And then somebody comes up with, and Pete knows the history on this, right? But somebody then at General Motors comes up with internal rate of return. And you realize some of our least big units deserve investments because they pay off more. And you think that came with the caveman because we all had to learn it, right? And it seems so logical, but it didn't. And so I'd love to see the HR profession and the profession of sort of people decisions progress in that way. What's our equivalent of internal rate of return, of cash flow analysis? And yes, there'll be measures, but those measures come after we have the principles.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, another limitation, and we've spoken about this before, but it's really about how firms categorize their workforce differently. So, even if you do mandate that firms have to disclose XYZ, they have entirely different ways of understanding their own employee base. Even if they release that information, that's an internal view. And as an external financial analyst or someone evaluating the company, you can't really make comparisons across companies unless there's consistency.
Yeah.
So that seems like very tough to solve, even with the right frameworks and point of view, which makes me a little more pessimistic. What do you think? Should I be as pessimistic, or you think that's overcomable?
I think that we could come up with frameworks that would generalize in the same way that cash flow analysis, and balance sheets and income statements, those things track across organizations. And I think it's because they're based on principles that everybody understands. So you're not going to look at a balance sheet for every firm. I get your point, but I think it's true in finance as well. If I have all these financial numbers, which are consistent and which are based on a consistent point of view, their implications vary a lot, depending on the organization, its strategic objectives, its stage of growth, et cetera. But the principles about how money flows through, how money affects the organization, hold up across that theory of the firm, that economic accounting financial theory of the firm, as a producer of value that then, generates value in society, whether shareholder value or not. It seems to me that holds up. And looking at all the models, we have a lot of alternative models, right? I would say, well, beyond HR, the book Pete and I wrote gives you one framework for going from strategy to your investments in people. There are other good frameworks out there that other firms or other think tanks have developed. And so I think for me, I watched these groups with such talented people ask the question, what measurements should be similar across organizations? And I've told this to Wayne, I kind of immediately wince and say, I just don't think that question can get you where we need to get to. Change the word measurements to principles, to decision frameworks. Now I think we have something we can work with.
I think that resonates with me also. I mean, so much of academic history is like about simplification. The big giants in every field are the ones that kind of took a whole body of complex ideas and kind of reduced it into something that generalizes. And in retrospect, it's seen as so simple, but at the time it was actually, like simplification is really the hardest part. And that kind of comes with looking at something for endless hours.
Yeah, sometimes you have to go really down the rabbit hole to come back out with a simple insight. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about jobs and work. And let me start with a question. Let's say you are at a proverbial cocktail party and someone says, "What do you do?" What do you say?
Oh, I say it this way. To give you context, I've been a professor my whole adult life at Cornell and then at University of Southern California. And the classes I taught would tuck under a business school, probably under the broad rubric of human resource management. And over the course of my career, I started deep in human resource management, optimistic that if we could measure the effects of investments in people, leaders would change the way they think. That turned out not to be true, no matter how sophisticated our models seem to get. So I turned to decision theory, trying to figure out what are the decision models that leaders are using, because they don't seem to pay attention when I show them a multi-million-dollar return to getting their selection system in order. And so I said, well, maybe, but they seem to be very good at calculating those kinds of returns for financial assets, for production assets. And so maybe I ought to be using those frameworks and translating them over to people. So for example, let's take a new one, portfolio theory. Every leader understands the idea of a tiered portfolio of investments, some long-term, some short-term, designed for, hedging, designed for some kind of predictable return in an unpredictable world, right?
Yeah.
And some of the principles are very straightforward. Like you understand when you day trade some investments because they're pretty short-term and you're going to day trade them and you may make mistakes. There are other things you buy and hold. They're long-term. They may be plant and equipment or bonds or whatever it is. And why not think of, we could say people, but I'm going to say skills and competencies that way. So increasingly, we hear a lot of talk about fundamental human capabilities and transient technical capabilities. And so for me, I would say, can't we think of those in portfolio theory? So what are the capabilities you buy and hold? And after you invest in them, you're going to draw on them for decades. And what are the capabilities that you day trade? Because they could go away tomorrow. And so the people who are being day traded, that's a very different relationship than the people that you bought into for these long-term skills. But it's not any less good. In the same way that day traded investments are not less good than buy and hold investments, it's just a matter of the right mix. And do we understand that? So there's an opportunity to sort of move toward that kind of thinking. And so that's what I looked at for a long time, wrote a book called Retooling HR, where I just went right through the MBA curriculum. What would portfolio theory say about people? What would production operations theory say about people? And just, what a bottleneck is in production? That's all I'm talking about when it comes to people, yeah. Right? And then finally, I would say to them, having, kind of gotten honestly a little tired of that, I moved toward the future of work and began writing with Robin about fractional work, in lead the work, gig economy, boundaryless labor force, et cetera, and then automation and then job deconstruction. So as of today, I get a lot of questions at cocktail parties about the future of work, about AI, about what should my kid be studying in school, are robots going to take over the world, all that kind of thing.
As you're saying it, what I'm really hearing a lot of is that you have played the role of a translator. Like you are taking ideas in business, operations, finance, et cetera, and you're applying them to people. And in doing that, leveling up the field of HR. But let's say we think of this cocktail party question as someone just wanting to know how you spend your days. And they kind of want to know, I met you during the weekend, let's say, and what do you do during your time? And of course, you do a collection of activities. You have a collection of responsibilities, collections of tasks. And sometimes you can describe that. And if you say, I'm a teacher, people kind of know that you do some grading, you do some preparation, you do some instruction, you do a collection of things. But for a lot of jobs, you don't really know, you can't really summarize that collection of things so easily. For you, when you want to just summarize the collection of stuff you do you find an easy way to do that? Or do you kind of have to list out, well, I write some books, I teach some classes, I serve on boards. Like do you rattle through stuff or do you think you can summarize that effectively?
Well, we may have to talk a bit about the distinction between rattling through. I do think that the way I describe my work, and probably work in general, it starts with kind of legs of the stool. So I would say, okay, you can think of me as, sometimes I look very much like a professor. These days, I've retired my professorship at USC, but I still, would be involved in some teaching and stuff like that. Sometimes I'm going to look like a conference speaker or a virtual, and that's a lot. That looks a lot like teaching. A lot of the skills that go into that go into teaching, but it's also a little bit different. There's some other things that I need to do. So you'd see me doing a lot of that, a lot of this kind of thing, and then you're going to see me being a kind of consultant. And that's not really so much delivering anything self-prepared as much as reacting and advising and coaching and that kind of thing. So my work with Doctors Without Borders, a lot of my work with companies who know me already, is not about come in and make a speech, but it's be at the shoulder of our team that's working on AI. And another time you're going to look at me and say, oh, he looks like a board member. So part of my work with Doctors Without Borders would look that way. Certainly my work with I4CP would look that way, where I'm advising on strategy and things like that and participating as a board member rather than as necessarily an external expert. The other leg would be the writing. And certainly in my past life, if you looked in my office, you'd usually find me working on a book or something that needed, that whenever I get a minute, I'm going to go back and pay attention to that, and then of course we say, well, wait, what about the rest of your life is the first thing I think of, and say, to really understand these things I've talked to you about, you need to understand a little bit about my life and where I'm embedded. For example, now I'm semi-retired in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's a massive difference in my existence than when I was full-time employed at a university in Los Angeles or Ithaca, New York. So I think we can get it, but that exercise, Ben, is a really good question. I like that because it does surface the implicit model that I'm using, and I didn't go to tasks. I didn't say, watch me press these keys on a keyboard or watch me use Word or any other application that I'm using. I sort of went almost to the outcomes of the work, a class being taught, a speech being given, advice being produced, etc.
I'll tell you what I do, and I don't like that I do this, but I find that, like, I think the way you're describing your kind of solution to this, and let me know if I'm mischaracterizing this, but it sounds like you're saying, well, I'm sort of a hybrid of a bunch of different occupations. And, you can think, you kind of know what consultants do. I kind of do that. You kind of know what teachers do. I kind of do that. And, you say like, all right, I'm a collection of occupations that you probably understand.
Right.
For me, I, wear a few hats. I operate a business. I teach, I'm a professor. I am a podcaster now, right. And I do a bunch of things and I don't really list them out. I instead just say I'm an economist.
And interesting.
That's really not, it's not descriptive of what I do. Like, if you had an economist at a bank, that is like a very, very different job, or an academic economist, like they do very different things than I do. And it's more a reflection on my identity. And then if someone says, well, what does that really mean? What do you do? Then I'm like, oh, well, I started a company and we do blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It's faster.
It sure is, but boy, does it, it so much goes, Ben, to what's the purpose of, and this is meant as nothing demeaning, right? I'm not challenging it. This is a really good exercise. I think this exercise needs to be done probably 1,000 times more often in organizations. They need a rubric for finding out what people do and what its value is and how it's perceived, et cetera. But it does speak to how much this is about communication. And you and I have talked a lot about this in your work, how much of it is about a common language almost. And if you say economist, I think you and I would both agree that is such a high level generic term that when you say it, that you're opening up a whole bunch of impressions in the mind of your audience. And you can choose to say, well, that's okay. I'm going to say economist. I know they're going to have a million different versions of economist in their head, but it gets
Yeah,
me
no,
in
it
the
happens to know
ballpark.
that nobody knows how to define economy.
Yeah,
That's like,
exactly. It's like me saying my crowd is like, I'll often, people will say, well, who are you in the world? Something like that, right? Aside from my
yeah,
personal stuff. And I would say, if you want to know my crowd, it would be people who have an interest in studying or doing what we would call human resource management or work management or work in organizations. And so not to be sort of self-aggrandizing, but to describe it is
go for it.
many of the top CHROs in the world know my book and know my work and would have had experience working with me. So if you want to think about the crowd in the world where you could probably drop them a line and say, have you ever heard of John Boudreau? It would be that, the group of CHROs and their teams, often in large organizations. And that's probably the closest I'd come. I don't think I'd ever say I'm a professor, which would probably be the equivalent, you'd know better than I would, occupational level, right? It's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. I don't know that I've ever been willing to take that risk and just say, oh, I'm a professor, because that could be anything from
Yeah.
literature to physics.
Right, right. You lose a lot of precision, and
Yeah.
you're a man who likes precision. So,
Right.
so fine. So let's talk a little bit about like as we get more toward that precision. You've made the case that work should be deconstructed, and we should understand jobs in a more deconstructed way in terms of their work elements, so that they can get unbundled, rebundled, reconfigured in various ways. What's the best pitch for why work should be deconstructed?
Yeah, I think the best
Or why
pitch.
jobs should be deconstructed
Yeah.
into work, rather.
Okay. Why should we look at jobs at a more molecular level? Let's say, right? What's
Yeah.
wrong with jobs? And you and I have talked about this a lot. There's a lot to be said for bundling tasks or whatever we call them, projects, what people do under a label called a job. I think the best argument, and you've certainly alluded to this in your book, I think the best argument comes from a coordination. The principle under which you should organize things people do under something like a job title. The best principle I can think of is when the coordination costs are so high, if you had a bunch of different people doing it, that it makes sense to put it all under one person. Now, that principle is not what I see being used. It's often, well, we like this person and we want to keep them, and the thing they were doing is going away, but we don't want to let them go. So I don't know. And it starts with the person, right? And you say, well, let's find something for them to do. And pretty soon that's their job, right? But so coordination makes a lot of sense. That's the positive side. The negative side is, and where this was motivated, it started a long time ago. I realize now, like I would talk about the payoff from improved performance in the early days with Pete and others, early 2000s. And our favorite example, or one that got a lot of popularity, was if you're at a Disney theme park and you see these people who are cleaning up the park, call them Disney sweepers, right? And you look at them and say, oh, their job must be to sweep the park and keep it clean, right? And then you see them drawing Mickey Mouse with a mop on the sidewalk, or they're the one you can ask, where's the bathroom, or how do I get on this ride? And they have a great answer for you, and they're kind of funny. And so it struck me that in that job, there were really two deliverables. One is keeping the park clean, but one is entertaining and engaging with guests. And the two of them have very different payoffs. Okay, I would say if we just knew sweeper, we'd never think to dissect it that way and realize that we should be telling those people, park cleaning, hey, this isn't a nuclear facility. It's got to be clean. If there's a big mess that's offending people, you get on that, right? Get the trash off. But keep your eyes open, because sometimes it's the right thing to do to leave a little bit of trash so that you can attend to that guest. And those switch offs, it seems to me, the way that people call it often job crafting, you can't see them. So that was the original. And I didn't even know I was doing deconstruction back then. Then years later, decades later, Robin and David Creelman and I wrote a book called Lead to Work that was about this emerging fractional workforce, gig workers, whatever you want to call them, and the notion that the boundary of work didn't need to be around a job, but could be around a task that you bring in, a contractor for, off of Upwork or something like that. And we realized that those people seldom take over a whole job. They take over some part of what people did. So we couldn't really write about fractional workers and a boundaryless work ecosystem without saying, well, first you're going to have to take it down to tasks, because that's where you're going to find the pattern. Well, then we wrote a book about automation. First thing you realize is, well, the popular rubric back then, this is 20 years ago, was robots will take over a job and you'll get the FTEs back. And yet the leaders we talked to said, that it's just not working. I can't give back these people. I still need them. Did I make a mistake? And we'd say, no, if you look at the task level, that robot is doing the tasks a robot ought to do. What people missed was that there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the work of those people that the robot won't do, and maybe new stuff. That translates pretty easily now to AI. But that's kind of where I just started seeing these. If I ever want to talk about automation and work, I can't do it at a job level because that's not where the effect happens. I can't talk about fractional labor at a job level. It's kind of the best analogy I ever came up with. I was working with a pet food company and they said, how can you help our leaders understand this? Because they don't do work design. And I said, well, do they understand the difference between creating dog food or cat food when you only have choices of how much bone, how much grain, and how much meat to put in versus creating those foods when you have nutrients to work with? And they said, well, yeah, that's obvious. And I said, that's all I'm saying. Sometimes the nutrient level is necessary.
Yeah. So this idea, I mean, it's such a powerful idea. And by the way, I think it is, like, at least from people that seem to be interested in this topic, it seems very much understood in ways that I would argue hasn't been understood even 5 years ago.
I agree.
So that's a plus. But this issue of kind of work reconfiguration, like let's say you introduce this automation and it automates certain tasks and doesn't automate other tasks.
Right.
The job gets reconfigured. So the task composition of the job does get reconfigured. But how do you understand the process in which that gets reconfigured? Is it an unbundling and rebundling? Like do we break everything down, or does someone just take on a new thing when part of their job is automated? Is it more gradual? And who determines that? Like in a job crafting framework, maybe it's the person who, maybe it's the Disney sweeper who says, I want to do what's right for the company and be entertaining. Or maybe it's the manager who says, you need to attend to these guests. So what is the process in which new kind of tasks get introduced, or new frequencies of time spent on tasks get introduced?
Yeah. I think you noted that this idea of the action is at the task level, so to speak. And I'm going to include there, it's not just what you do. It would also be tasks related to teamwork, tasks related with organizational boundaries, social networks. All those things I think could be equally codified in terms of, but what do you do? What are the things you execute or things you deliver? And I think you're right. And here's what I'm getting at. Over the last 5 years, certainly over the last 10, when Robin and I wrote Reinventing Jobs, this was our first book on automation. That's probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And certainly when we wrote Lead to Work, let's call it 10 years ago. In those days, jobs was the rubric. And I don't think they didn't really know why they were having so much trouble. I don't know that it had been articulated, and we weren't the first ones. When I started writing about automation, I looked at the economists' work on automation, and I realized they were way ahead of us in one way. They were already looking at tasks. All the, Nobel Prize winning economists in today's world, right? All the people at Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, et cetera. You'd look at their research and you go, oh, they were smart enough to pull this apart. They're talking about whether tasks are automatable, not whether jobs are automatable. Then, inexplicably to me, they figured they needed to create an index of job automatability. And they just sort of arbitrarily added up all those task automatabilities to say, well, if more than 50% of them are automatable, we'll say your job is likely to be automated, right? If less than 10% are automatable, we'll say your job is less likely. And I was just saying, why did you do that? It's so much clearer to understand it where the action happens is at this task level. And so I think what's happened
in their defense, I mean, as from I think there's some research that I think gets interpreted by the media as like, if the aggregation of tasks exceeds a certain amount, it's more prone to automation. But I know at least some of those authors are very careful to say on every page that this does not mean automation risk. So there's some telephone that happens from the framework and the model to the interpretation and the doom and gloom from that you see once something's been interpreted by or filtered through the media.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I think I would say, again, we could differ a little bit, but I'm going to say to make the point, I think even economists were talking jobs 10 or 15 years ago. Even though in their research, they knew they were doing tasks. The world just wasn't ready. And it's not that I'm the only one at all that did it, right? But today, you're right. I think everybody, man on the street, woman on the street, et cetera, knows that when we talk about automation, it's how will your work be altered? And that alteration may be so severe that you could lose your employment because the automation can do so much. But that's not because we set out to lift you out of that job and replace you. It's more that as we looked at the work, the level of alteration is such that we need to find something completely different for you or something like that. So I like that. And I think the skills based, again, as you know, I have a good deal of consternation about skills as a construct, but it's popular and it's caught the public imagination and it's caught the imagination of C-suite leaders. I'll take it. Because to talk about skills, you've got to get comfortable with disaggregation. And if that's the thin edge of the wedge that gets CEOs to understand work can be thought of at a more molecular level, as much as the skills concept to me is pretty fuzzy, I'll take it as an entry level to talk to them about the power of thinking that way. And then, as you said, so what's the process? That's a good one. I think it's case specific. Like what I say to leaders is, you don't have to remake your whole system. You don't have to get rid of all your jobs and put everything in a skills taxonomy and let AI run around and recreate work, all the time. Certainly not for your whole workforce at all. But there are places where you are frustrated because you can't get things done, like automating, like AI, et cetera. And you don't know why, and your leaders don't know why they're frustrated. And if you were to tell them, what if I let you get rid of all the job titles and just put all the work on a table, so to speak, or in front of us, and put circles around the stuff that AI or automation is going to do, and then look at all the human work that's left. And what if we were free then to say, what would a good job bundle look like now? That's kind of the most extreme version of what I'm talking about, Ben. And I think what happens is they throw AI out there, people start using it, and they realize certain parts of their work can be done better by AI. So I think it's very haphazard in a way right now. And while people talk about experiments, mostly what I see is pilots. In that, we're not really watching the results. It's not a pre-post test. There's no comparison groups. It's not like testing a product feature where you would have a group that saw it and a group that didn't see it. This is much more like, oh, I don't know, go put that product feature in, and we'll just see what happens.
At large companies, I think that sounds very hard. But what about at startups? Like at small growing companies, some of them have very rigid, ways that they do things, and some of them just kind of craft roles organically. Do you think that the ambassadors of new bundles will be small companies? Is that happening already? What do you think?
It's a really good question. I'm sure I don't know the answer. I will observe and agree with you in small startup-like companies, or even within big companies where the subunit is allowed to act like that, where everybody knows everybody can kind of, at the extreme, right? Everybody knows everybody knows the work that we're all doing. It's only about 50 people. We all know each other. And so it's very easy to look across at other people, see what they're doing, see how that might combine with what you're doing, swarm to a project because there's a deadline, all that kind of thing. And I would just say it's that philosophy that I think I'd like to see carried forward to larger organizations. Now, obviously, once you try to do it at scale, it requires infrastructure, it requires data, it requires what we talked about before, decision models, points of view, et cetera. It's not quite so easy. You could also say, we're going to empower our teams. There are boundaries here, right? So we're going to automate a call center. Well, I don't know that our production people need to get involved in that. It's unlikely, that that's going to be a big deal. So maybe we take the call center team, the leaders and the workers in that team, and we say, you're free to operate like this because you all can see the work that other people do. You all can see where if you were allowed to swarm to a project and somebody didn't say, what are you doing over here? That's not your job, so to speak. A lot of things could get done better. So I don't disagree. And I think we're, Ben, right in this amazing moment where everything is unfrozen. I don't think we really know what skills are. I don't think we know if we need a taxonomy or not, or which of the competing taxonomies is going to be the one. I don't think leaders really have a protocol or a framework for thinking about how human work combines with work from other sources. But they all know that the old way of thinking of stable jobs and what work means is going to a job for an employer. I think everybody's realizing that's probably not going to hold up in a lot more areas than we thought. Now the search is on for what would be the alternative.
And, with this chaos comes opportunity to introduce
Yes.
new ways of thinking about things. So my one final question for you is that if you had one lesson to kind of shout from the rooftops and you want everyone to hear, what do you think? What do you think that is?
I'll give you the one that I like. And again, you and I have talked about it. With all due respect to jobs and the tangible value that a job creates as an organizing framework. So not to deny that, you and I have been around that a lot. And you've helped me understand that I probably can't say deconstruct everything, right? But I would say I would love to see every time someone uses the word job to describe work, that they start substituting the word work. And then we've got a term, right? That term work could apply to a job, but it doesn't have to. And I think when we restate, so politicians should be saying, we're going to create good work. And that may be in the form of jobs, but when you say work, you realize, well, that might not mean a job, huh? Leaders should start thinking about work and work. And you're hearing this now from folks like Diane Gerson and other leaders. Can we call it the human resource profession is not about jobs or job design or job families or whatever we use, but about work and about providing the organization with that point of view and with the infrastructure necessary to manage work and know when jobs are the right way to do it and know when they aren't.
That sounds exciting. I would love to see the next Work Friday come out. The new work numbers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being part of the show. It's great chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks for everything you're doing. Appreciate it.
The Economics of Work is brought to you by Revelio Labs, workforce data for research and benchmarking. If you enjoyed, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It'll help us reach other curious listeners. I'm your host, Ben Zweig. Our producer is Cole Wagner. Thanks for listening.